Dr. Susan Yoshihara. I'm the Senior Vice President at the Center for Family and Human Rights. We have offices in New York and Washington. I'm a resident of Portsmouth, and I've lived here for many years. So I'll just get right to the point. There were a lot of facts thrown out tonight, and I just wanted to go over a few, just to submit that there's a different way of looking at some of them. In my organization, we look at international policy research for social policy, and in particular, we've looked at maternal mortality rates for the last 10 years. A lot has been said about safe abortion tonight, that making abortion legal makes it safe, and some of the international data that was brought out, I just wanted to bring to light that some of that was not correct. Maternal mortality, the rate is about 250,000, it's actually less now, per year throughout the world. That is, it's very difficult to know how many of those come from abortions. There was a number thrown out tonight, but that's 48,000. That's the total number, 13% of the total number. Now, even though the total number has been adjusted down from 500,000 to 248,000, that 13% stays the same. The reason that's not accurate is simply because we don't know how many there are. In fact, what we know is where unborn life is protected in countries like Malta and countries like Ireland, we have the lowest maternal mortality rates. Okay. In Chile, where you also have very protective laws for the unborn child, you also have very low maternal mortality rates. Now, Chile is very interesting, and so I would ask you, if you're looking at what safe abortion is, to look at Chile, because they had both very liberal laws and restrictive laws over the course of the last 100 years, and they also keep impeccable records, better than in this country, actually. And what they found is that maternal mortalities have been decreasing over the last 100 years, whether they were liberalized or whether they were restricted. So that begs the question, well, what does account for a reduction in maternal deaths? According to the World Health Organization, it is just an improvement in basic health care. And in particular, things like prenatal care, emergency obstetric care, skilled attendance at birth, basic things, especially in the developing world, things like clean water, places to deliver a child. So just to put to rest that idea that the laws have something to do with maternal mortality rates, that's not true. The second thing we heard, and this from a young, energetic OBGYN, is that science is fact. Well, it's interesting because Science, the Journal of Science, just published an article where they tried to, 270 researchers tried to replicate 100 experiments of 3 prestigious psychology journals, and only 39 times could they reproduce them. The Journal of Nature has concluded 75 to 90% of preclinical biomedical studies published in peer-reviewed journals are not reproducible. Now, why does that matter? Well, reproducing scientific studies is the gold standard. It means that it can be quoted, etc. So I would just submit that science is not always fact, and even the Journal of Science has said so. We also heard that late-term abortions are a myth, again, from this young doctor. Well, that's interesting because if you've been following this debate, and I know you all have, I'll just say this anyway, the federal court cases which have been challenged, these partial birth abortion bans have been challenged, we had abortionists testifying, and the abortionists testifying against those bans actually did describe the late-term abortions, so, and there are transcripts on that. And I'd also note that the CDC, just looking at 1 year, 2008, reported 13,000 late-term abortions. Now, they also said that was sort of a lowball number because they only reported 825,000 abortions in 2008. But California was not reporting. You probably know because of privacy reasons, California doesn't report, and we know that that's probably where most of the abortions occur. So the number was probably higher, about 1.2 million that year. So much for the myth of late-term abortions. Another was that unintended pregnancies tend to lead to bad outcomes for children. Now, I would just urge you to look at the World Bank's latest study on this. They have concluded, after looking at this for quite a while, that there's insufficient data that exists to indicate that unintended pregnancies relate to negative outcomes in both health and education for children. So again, the other thing I would look at is the Guttmacher Institute's definition of unintended. So that includes both mistimed, which means probably before you wanted to become pregnant, and also unwanted. The doctor said that was half all pregnancies. In fact, it's 40% globally. And that includes the US and the UK, where birth control is pretty much ubiquitous. And what's also interesting about the Guttmacher definition of unintended is that they say that all of those, mistimed or unwanted, are all conscious decisions. The pregnancy was a conscious decision. I mean, even in that definition, you can see that you could probably pull that apart and see how valuable the term unintended was. And of course, this idea that only 1%, we heard from the doctor, 1% of pregnancies are regretted. And then later we heard about a study, the PLOS Online study from 2015, where 95% of those respondents said that they did not regret. Now that's true. But what you did not hear is that was a very flawed study, that 62% of the respondents said they would not partake in the study and 15% dropped out. Now why is that important? Why is it important that only they had a 31.9% participation rate? And the reason is because these were self-selected. And some of the reasons that PLOS Online in that study gave, was that the rest said that they refused to take part because they just wanted to forget the emotion. And so what the journal concluded, what the conclusion was for those who criticized this study, is that these self-selected probably had already figured a way past those regrets, and it didn't capture those other women. Now, that doesn't mean that those weren't valid for those women. It simply means that that study was incorrectly used to describe women at large. Okay, so again, just looking at facts and studies that have been presented, I would just recommend we look more deeply into them. I guess what it says to me is the same doctor said she doesn't want to be regulated, but we regulate all kinds of things in the state. And I would say that while, and I appreciated the exchange that you had, Representative Wilkinson, with her, because I was pregnant. My very first pregnancy was at 44, so I also got that kind of exchange. Certainly you want to find out early about the child, etc. And it does matter who you're talking to. And so I would say that she probably needs help, because a lot of the things she said as facts certainly aren't fact. And so there's nothing wrong with us helping her by regulating that industry. Another good question, the representative is gone now, but a very good question was asked of a lot of those who have testified, is when you think life begins. Well, I would just submit that's a great question, but it's different from when pregnancy begins. Life begins, we know life begins at conception. I mean, that's really not disputed. You heard it, the doctor say that. But when pregnancy begins, it's actually been changing if you look at the literature, right? So pregnancy, now doctors will tell you it's an implantation, and therefore anything you take before that doesn't influence pregnancy. So again, look at those definitions, look at those terms, and kind of look behind what the very, very confident experts say. And the last thing I would just say, because I'm not getting out of here without some personal story, and that is, I commend those who put forward the sex selection abortion ban. I'm not an Asian woman, as you can see, but both of my daughters will be Asian women. One's my biological daughter, and the other is adopted from Asia. And, I think, and I will speak for them because they're in bed, I think they would certainly be in favor of being protected, just on the basis that they're going to turn out to be women who might not be wanted. My little girl, who perhaps was not wanted, I will never know why her mother chose not to keep her. I'm certainly glad she gave her life, and she's a terrific kid. So please support the ban on sex-selective abortions. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.